Thanks for joining us here on 9 News Plus. I'm Chris Bianchi. Southwest Airlines saw an unprecedented meltdown, a fiasco, whatever it is you want to call it, but we all know what happened over the Christmas holiday. More than 15,000 flights canceled last month, and hundreds of thousands of passengers, myself included, stranded back over the Christmas holiday as a result of all of that mess. Now, we've heard various explanations about what exactly happened, whether it's been old software, whether it's been pilots out of position. There's been a number of different explanations, even plain old weather. But to get the real story behind it, we're now joined by 9 News aviation expert and analyst, Greg Feith. Greg, thanks so much for joining us here today.
Hey, Chris.
So, Greg, what exactly happened?
Well, it was a combination of things, and it can happen to any airline. Unfortunately, it happened to be Southwest's turn with regard to this, quote, meltdown. The weather, of course, played a dramatic effect, not only in one particular city, but across the country. And when you have weather that affects multiple major airports, where some of them are hubbed airports, all of a sudden now you get airplanes that are stranded on the ground, and it then creates a tsunami, a ripple effect, because all airline operations, all airline schedules are predicated on airplanes constantly moving. Because of whether it's a hub and spoke or with Southwest, they're direct point to point. If you get one airplane on the ground and it can't move to the next destination on schedule, all of a sudden you start backing up all of the other flights, because not only do you have an airplane out of position, but now you have a flight crew that's out of position. A flight crew doesn't stay with the same airplane throughout the day. And so you get a pilot or two pilots that are stranded in Denver. They're supposed to fly to Chicago and then pick up another airplane for a trip to Tulsa. And all of a sudden now they can't do it. Now the airline scrambles to try and put a flight crew on that particular flight. And if there isn't a flight crew available because of weather, because you couldn't get a flight crew in, or you don't have a reserve base there to bring a new crew in there, all of a sudden now the system starts to come unglued.
I'll say this, though. You mentioned some of those backups. Why was Southwest specifically so hard hit? Other airlines had some problems, especially around the Christmas holiday and that big winter storm, but it seemed like Southwest had way more interruptions than the other airlines. Why was that?
There are multiple explanations out there with regard to what happened with Southwest. Of course, the weather and having airplanes out of position stuck at airports. But one of the concerns by the Southwest Airline Pilot Association is the fact that because of their growth, that is the airline's growth, the fact that they are bringing in more pilots, operating more airplanes, their scheduling system is antiquated. It isn't keeping up with the complexities involved with that growth. So they weren't able to properly or effectively match airplanes and flight crews. And when you get one out of position, or multiple airplanes out of position and flight crews, and you don't have the ability to get a reserve crew in there or take another crew off another flight, put them on an airplane, all of a sudden now you have multiple airplanes out of position, multiple flight crews out of position, and it becomes a scheduling problem. And it takes a long time to try and match flight crews, because you got to get a flight crew, you got to position them, you got to fly them in, get them to pick up that trip, move that airplane. And again, all the airports that were affected by this weather event did not reopen or did not continue their normal operations at the same time. It was a progressive thing as that storm moved across the country. So again, it's an act of Mother Nature influencing basically some antiquated systems. But travel by air, passengers have to have patience.
I'll say this, though. The pilots union released what I would call, at the minimum, a scathing statement. They said that Southwest headquarters and former CEO Gary Kelly specifically has turned the airline into a, quote, cult. That's pretty harsh language, is that not?
Well, it all depends on how you define a cult. Herb Kelleher started an airline, and he was really people-centric, people-oriented. He created an airline where he wanted to have the best customer service. And there are now stories out there that since Herb stepped down and, of course, is passing, and a new management team has cycled in, they are now putting profits over passengers. And that is, it has changed the culture there. It has changed the dynamic there. Whether that's true or not, I don't work there, so it's hard to really tell. But people that I've talked to have indicated that. The fact is that with any airline, customer service, is got to be priority number one. Why? Because it's the passengers who support that carrier. And so Southwest is going to have to take an introspective look at their policies, their processes, and the tools that they have available, not only for the flight crews, that is the pilots, but also the flight attendants. Because if you get flight attendants out of position, you can't fly that airplane. You cannot fly a 737 full of people and not have the proper number of flight attendants on that airplane. So it goes beyond the pilots. The pilots were just the ones that were very vocal. But again, it can happen to any airline, and we've seen that. Summertime operations, Chicago shuts down. That has a real dramatic effect on United and American Airlines.
Question based off of that, though, how do the airlines move forward from here? And I ask that in the sense of, I know that Southwest kind of innovated these tight turnaround times that a lot of these airlines operate by. Do they start expanding out some of those turnaround times to give them a bit more leeway in the event of a weather delay?
It all depends on the business model, Chris, as to what the airline intends to do. Because the business model for a Spirit or a Frontier Airlines is different than Southwest, and Southwest business model is totally different than the legacy carriers like Delta, United, American. And so, when you have these short turnaround times, you are racing the clock. But you got to remember that you're going to have delays, especially in the wintertime, because even if you turn that airplane around in 22 minutes or whatever the target time is for the airline, now that airplane has to push off the gate. It's got to go sit in line to get de-iced. And all of a sudden now the clock's still running. It puts that airplane behind schedule just because of the fact that there are other policies, processes that need to occur. So I think and now the government wants to step in and really take a critical look at airline operations using Southwest as the catalyst to try and understand what happened. This isn't the first time in history it's happened. And so they're going to try and look at it to see how they can make the system more effective or efficient. And it's going to start with really an internal introspective look by Southwest to see where they need to ramp up their operation. They've expanded very quickly over the past several years. I mean, they're opening new bases or opening new cities that they fly to, but you have to have an infrastructure within the organization to be able to accommodate that. We've seen the failure of other airlines who have tried to expand very quickly. When you look at Piedmont Airlines, they were a homegrown airline that started to expand, and when they got to expansion too quickly, they ran into problems. ValueJet was another rapid growth airline that the FAA couldn't keep up with, and we had safety issues. And they eventually culminated in a major accident that really put them out of business, because I was the investigator in charge on the ValueJet accident in the Florida Everglades. They then morphed into AirTran. Well, AirTran doesn't exist anymore either. So there are a lot of historic airline lessons to be learned. And I think they're going to have to really take a major look at all of this to see where they can streamline and make these systems more efficient, especially when there is a weather event.
Greg, I guess my final question, based off of what you've said, and correct me if I'm wrong, it sounds like for passengers, the lesson is this could happen again, and we're still at the mercy of Mother Nature, even with all this technological innovation. And for airlines, maybe there's some minor room for innovation, and that may come from the federal government. Are those the top takeaways here?
I think one we always talk about, and I preach it to people when they ask me about flying. It's like time to spare, go by air. That's why, as a passenger, you just have to have patience, because the first priority, regardless of anything else, the first priority at an airline is safety. And they are not going to put the airplane into the air full of crews and passengers and put them in harm's way. The FAA will not allow that to happen. That's why we have the federal aviation regulations. They are bound by that. They can't just arbitrarily say, well, I'm going to do it anyway. It doesn't work that way. And so, the airlines must follow policies and procedures dictated by the federal government. And while a lot of people don't understand the limitations, safety is always integrated into those limitations. So you have to understand that. Now, the customer service issue, that's going to be one of those things that, not only from an airline to airline perspective, looking at themselves and how they handle passengers, but the federal government, the Secretary of Transportation has said that they are going to help take a look at some of these policies and procedures to see if they can make customer priority more of an emphasis point than what it was during this quote meltdown.
That's, I suppose, reasonably comforting for myself and all the other Southwest customers. But Greg Feith, 9 News Aviation analyst, thanks so much for joining us here on 9 News Plus today and giving us some insight about what happened at Southwest and what might come of it moving forward. Thanks so much.
I'll tell you what, Chris, let me just give you one more because I didn't answer your question completely, so you can cut this in.
Absolutely.
One of the things about technology, and the airplanes have advanced as far as technology is concerned over the last 30, 40 years, especially when it comes to weather operations, whether it's thunderstorms in the summertime or wintertime operations, snow, ice, things like that. But again, airplanes cannot fly in pure icing conditions. That's why airplanes have to be de-iced and things like that. And we've had an accident, a major accident here in Denver that was very prominent, Continental 1713, where the airplane wasn't properly de-iced and they tried to take off and we had a catastrophic event. We've seen that over history. In the summertime, we have these thunderstorms. You report about them all the time. We have microbursts. We have wind shear events. Dallas was very famous for having an L-1011 operated by Delta Airlines that crashed because of a wind shear event. So weather does limit the operation of the aircraft, no matter how technologically advanced that airplane is. And flight crews are trained to handle certain conditions, but you are not going to depart from an airport where that weather could present a threat to aviation safety. So yes, there's technology. Yes, the flight crews are trained for it. But again, operating limitations, not only by the government, but also by the airline, dictate when that airplane moves and how it moves.
The big takeaway, and maybe positive, optimistically looking here, is that the safety record, and as you mentioned, safety is paramount. So if you're getting on a plane, you're about as safe as can be, right?
When you think about getting on that aircraft, even during a weather event, for them to depart, the fact is that they've done all of the things necessary. They've taken as many precautions as they possibly can. They looked at the operating limitations of the aircraft, the flight crew, and determined that the risk has been mitigated. It's never going to be zero in aviation. It's never zero on the highway or anywhere else, just walking across the street. But the airlines take as many opportunities as they can to evaluate and mitigate that risk. That is the intent of an airline operating safely. And when you look at the safety record, we haven't had a major catastrophic accident here in the United States where we've had a large aircraft crash since 2001, when we lost an A300 Airbus in Queens, New York. We've had a couple of regional type aircraft that have crashed, but when you think about all the number of operations per day, which are tens of thousands just here in the United States, we have a very safe system. And while some people may not understand, because of the airline and then getting upset, it is all in the interest of safety, and we have the safest system in the world. So that is the comforting factor. When you get on an airplane, you can rest assured that your chances of getting struck by lightning are greater than you being involved in an aircraft accident.
Wow, that is stunning and telling, Greg. Well, I always like to close things out on that optimistic, positive note. So I appreciate you providing that here, Greg, because it is still, at the end of the day, a very safe system. And if you kind of outlined that for us, but unfortunately, as you mentioned, it can have those big consequences like what we had with Southwest Airlines back at the end of December. But 90s aviation analyst Greg Feith, thanks so much for joining us here on 90s Plus today.
You're welcome, Chris.
We appreciate it.